Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an Airbus pilot, and in today's video let's deal with the topic of brake temperatures and how to keep them low. We are standing here in Frankfurt, we've just completed our startup and our pushback, and we are about to start our taxi out to runway 18, which is a rather long taxi indeed. Now, our airplane has been cold and dark overnight, so our brake temperatures are rather low, but especially when you are coming in and did a turnaround, the brake temperatures might be rather high, so in this video we will discuss how to manage them properly. Now, in previous versions of the Fenix Airbus that was not really a problem since the brake temperature simulation basically didn't exist, but now with the Block 2 release there is a very sophisticated brake temperature simulation in the Fenix Airbus, and it is rather important to keep that in mind, especially when you're doing shorter turnarounds or longer taxis. In terms of longer taxis, we're standing in Frankfurt and we are going to taxi to runway 18 today from the easternmost apron, so that is going to be a rather lengthy taxi. And to add to that, we have IAE engines which have a rather high idle thrust and therefore make the airplane taxi on idle thrust. And on top of that, we do have some icing conditions outside with some rain and the temperatures at 4 degrees, which means that we need to use anti-ice. All of these combined, we get an even higher idle N1, and the airplane is going to start rolling on its own when the brake is released. Right now I've released the brake and you can see the airplane immediately starts to move, even with the thrust levers in idle. This means that we will need to apply braking throughout the taxi. But in order to understand how much brakes we will need, and in order to understand how to keep the brakes cool nonetheless, let's first of all understand how those carbon brakes work. And the important thing for us to understand here is how do they heat up and how do they cool down. Now, carbon brakes heating is of course influenced by the amount of energy the brakes have to take, but it is likewise also influenced by the amount of brake applications. So if I'm sitting here and constantly applying a little bit of brakes, then release them again, another little bit of brakes, release them again, and so on, that is not going to end up very well. That is going to end with the brakes becoming very hot. Now, in order to manage them properly, let's first of all understand how hot the brakes are allowed to become so that we're even allowed to take off. And in the A320 there are two limits in question. The first limit is the brake temperature without the use of a brake fan. And the maximum allowable brake temperature for takeoff is 300 degrees centigrade. So 300 degrees centigrade is the maximum. However, if your airplane has brake fans installed, the maximum allowable temperature for takeoff reduces to 150 degrees centigrade. Why is there a difference? Well, the difference exists because of where the brake temperature sensors are installed. They're installed on the outer part of the brakes, where temperature is influenced stronger by the brake fans that are shoving cool air on the brakes than the inner part of the brakes, which might be hotter. For this reason you also see the brake temperature increase long after the landing. You will still see it rise, because obviously the inner part of the brakes, the part where the heat actually is produced, is the one that's hottest, and the outer part of the brakes, where the sensors are located, are going to be the coolest. Now, this applies in a twofold logic. After a turnaround, it is fair to say that the temperatures will rise for a while, but after a turnaround, it is fair to say that the temperatures will have stabilized, and therefore your brake temperature indication is going to be correct and acceptable. However, just to give you an idea, when you are landing, you don't use the thrust reversers and you use a medium brake setting. Your indicated brake temperatures will go anywhere between 300 and 400 degrees centigrade, depending on the circumstances. However, the temperature in the inner part of the brake can be as much as 1000 degrees centigrade. Just remember that when you're thinking about brake temperatures. So now that we understand a little bit about the way the brake temperatures are measured and indicated, let's talk about techniques how to keep them low. First of all, have a look at how I'm taxiing the airplane. You've seen that I didn't use any thrust above idle in order to get the airplane moving. Indeed, quite the opposite. I kept the engines at idle and accepted that it took a little bit longer for the airplane to start accelerating. That way, we do not put any excess energy into the entire system that we later on might need to break away again. You can see, even on idle, we're at 20 knots right now and the airplane is still accelerating, and we will eventually reach our speed limit of 30 knots. Now, as I mentioned, carbon brakes wear down and heat up per brake application. For this reason, we want to avoid putting in continuous brakes, or we want to avoid having the brakes continuously pressed in order to maintain our maximum of 30 knots. So what is going to be our taxi technique then? Well, as you can see, I simply let the airplane accelerate. We're 25 knots now, we will reach 30 eventually. And by the time we reach 30, we're going to apply one continuous, smooth brake application to bring it back down towards 10 knots. And then we'll start having it accelerate again until reaching 30 again, breaking it back down, and so on. And that pattern we are basically going to put on repeat until we eventually reach our runway. Your aim should be to use as little brake applications as possible in terms of the total number. Once the brakes are applied, you can use them. So we're reaching 30 knots now. Let's start applying some brakes as soon as we see that go up. Here you go, 31. So I am applying some brakes now, and I'm basically slowly but steadily, the beginning was a little bit quick, I still need to get used to the new Fenix brakes as well, bring it back down towards 10 knots. When we've reached 10 knots, let go of the brakes again and let the airplane accelerate back up to 30 knots. And that is basically how you can conserve most brake temperature. Now, flight simmers do like to do shorter turnarounds than aircraft do in the real world. You barely do turnarounds more than half an hour, do you? Let alone 1 hour for the old legacy airlines. So brake temperature management certainly is going to be important to you, even on landing, in order to plan your turnaround and make sure that the brakes don't overheat when you are going to depart again. Now, here are a couple of techniques that you can use in order to conserve brake temperature. First of all, lower auto brake settings might of course keep the heat down a little bit, but to be honest, that doesn't have too much of an effect really, because the energy dissipated is going to be mostly influenced not by the brake setting, but actually by the use of the thrust reverser. Therefore, whenever you can, use maximum thrust reverse to keep the brakes cool. And here's something to think about. It might just about be an idea to use no auto brakes at all. Always remember, the energy is relevant on the speed squared. So if you don't use your wheel brakes at all at high speeds, but only use them at low speeds, you can keep your brakes much cooler than if you are using the wheel brakes from the beginning on. Now, therefore, it may be an idea to use no auto brake and maximum reverse, and then do manual braking only when you get down to, say, below 100 knots. So we're reaching a little turn here. You can see I'm reducing my speed gradually here, aiming for 10 knots once again. But be aware of how tight a turn is. You don't need to go down to 10 knots if you are doing just a slight turn, like the one that's going to come up right over there. But much rather, you can take those turns at a little bit higher speed in the favor of using one less brake application. There is a little joke going around in my airline on the A330 that whenever you press the brake pedals, you're basically spending 40 euros. And there is a little bit of truth to it if you take into account how much those brakes actually cost and how they wear down, which is on every single brake application. So, this is just a little bit of a theory there of how you can conserve your brake energy and what to take into account. Now that we're about to reach the runway, there is of course the important check of the brake temperatures. As you can see, we kept them really low, 25 degrees, might go up to 30 or maybe 35 by the time we reach the runways, so there is no problem at all. However, if you would apply constant braking and just hit the brakes ever again and again and again, that might very well change. And especially if the brakes are hot already, this is something that you very much need to take into account. Once again, remember the maximum temperatures without a brake fan, and this particular airframe here doesn't even have one installed. Without a brake fan, 300 degrees centigrade is the maximum, but even at the maximum, keep in mind, your brakes are going to be much weaker than if you start with cooler brakes. So the cooler they are, the better it is. In the real world, what we do on the A330 is we do aim to have the brake temperatures below about 150 degrees, even if we don't have a brake fan installed on the planes at all. So, brake fan is another topic worth talking about and certainly worth mentioning. If the brake fan is installed, remember the brake fan starts cooling the brakes from the outer part of the brakes onwards and not from the inner part. Therefore, the temperature sensor is located on the outer part of the brakes as well. So the limit for brake fan takeoff, to call it like that, is 150 degrees centigrade. Now the FCOM does recommend that as soon as the temperature does reach 150, you are going to turn the brake fan off. The background behind that is if you use the brake fan on a hot brake, it is going to cause oxidation of the brake and therefore wear the brakes down. So in an ideal scenario, even if you have a brake fan installed on your aircraft, you will try to avoid its usage as much as you can. So if the temperatures can be kept down to a reasonable amount, say below 200 degrees for the takeoff, maybe 220 degrees as well, then you want to avoid using the brake fan and much rather want to keep the brake fan off and just accept that your temperatures are a little bit higher but well within the limit, and with that I mean far outside the limit enough that you don't risk actually causing any brake oxidation when running the brake fan, and that you don't risk over-temperaturing the brakes. Is that a word, over-temperaturing? You know what I mean. Causing the temperature to rise too high during your taxi out as well. Alright, and that basically concludes this video. I do hope you found this one interesting. I do hope that I've been able to shed a little bit of light into some techniques for managing the brake temperature on takeoff, and that we are able, with this information, to keep our takeoff safe. Just to give you another idea, with all the braking required, we've now heated the brakes up to 40 degrees centigrade, but imagine if you've landed and you arrive at the gate with the brakes at 400 degrees, it's gonna take some 20 or 30 minutes for the brakes to cool down to, say, 250 degrees, for example. And when you start your pushback with the brakes at 250 degrees, and then you do a taxi out like we just did, you are down close to your takeoff limitation already. So that is something that you absolutely want to keep in mind. And especially when you're doing turnaround flights or when you're flying into hot and high airports where you're dealing with more energy in the airplane for taxi. And most importantly, did you notice how we did the entire taxi from the apron all the way to the runway, which is approximately 4 kilometers, without doing a single thrust application, just keeping the engines completely in idle? That is ideally what you should aim for. So, thank you very much for watching. I do hope you found this one interesting. If you did, be sure to leave a comment below the video. Be sure to leave a like on YouTube, as it does really help out the channel. And if you're up for more, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you very much for watching, and if you really love what I'm doing here, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you for watching, and see you all again on the next one.